Welcome to the deep dive. Are you ready to get into some pretty murky waters?
Always up for a challenge.
Okay, good. Because today we're tackling the question, is China a threat to the world?
Oh, that's a big one.
It is. And we're not shying away from the tough stuff. We've got scholarly articles, historical analyses, even environmental reports, all to try and get to the bottom of this. So buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
From what I've seen, some scholars aren't just worried, they're using the term cancer cell to describe China.
Cancer cell. I mean, that's a pretty intense comparison, right?
Yeah, no, it sounds extreme, but that's exactly the analogy some sources are using. They're arguing that China, just like a cancer cell, grows uncontrollably, disregards the rules, and often harms its surroundings.
Okay, I see where they're going with this.
Yeah.
But how does this actually play out in the real world?
Well, they point to China's stance on Taiwan as a prime example.
Right, the whole one China policy.
Yeah. Exactly. It's not just about claiming Taiwan, it's the constant pressure, the military drills, the refusal to even acknowledge Taiwan's sovereignty. This, according to the sources, shows that Cancerous urge to expand, even if it means breaking international norms.
Okay, I'm starting to see the parallels. But to really get this analogy, I think we need to understand the bigger picture.
Absolutely. We need to understand the role of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. They've been running the show since 1949, and their ideology has totally shaped Chinese society and culture.
So the CCP is kind of like the DNA of this cancer cell.
That's a good way to put it. The sources really dig into the CCP's need for control, both within China and on the world stage.
But hold on a sec. I'm all for a good analogy, but comparing a whole country to a disease seems a bit, I don't know, dehumanizing.
That's a valid point, for sure. And it's important to remember, we're talking about complex systems here, not individual cells under a microscope.
Right, of course.
But the sources argue that this analogy helps us see some patterns of behavior that we might otherwise miss.
Okay, fair enough. So let's unpack this analogy a bit further. The sources actually get into some pretty interesting biology to back up their argument. They even talk about apoptosis.
Ah, yes. Programmed cell death. Apoptosis is crucial for healthy growth. It's like a natural recycling system for cells. Keeps things in balance.
Right. And cancer cells, well, they don't follow the rules, do they?
Nope. They ignore the signals that tell them to stop and just keep on multiplying, gobbling up resources, and ultimately harming the host.
And the sources are suggesting that China, or at least the CCP, is doing something similar.
Exactly. They're arguing that China's constant push for economic growth, even if it hurts the environment or their own people, looks a lot like that unchecked, damaging behavior we see in cancer cells.
Okay, I see the connection, but I need some real-world examples here. What does this cancerous behavior actually look like?
Well, one of the most glaring examples is China's environmental record. And frankly, it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, the environment. Everyone's talking about it these days. But how bad is it, really?
Imagine this. The year is 2007. A massive algae bloom has taken over Lake Tai in China. 2 million people in the city of Wuxi are suddenly without drinking water.
2 million? That's incredible. What caused that?
Decades of pollution, mainly from industrial waste and agricultural runoff, they've been pouring into the lake, basically suffocating it. And it's not just Lake Tai, it's major rivers like the Yangtze, too. And that pollution can spread, impacting surrounding countries.
Like a domino effect, one polluted waterway leads to another. Speaking of dominoes, one of the sources mentioned fish disappearing from Bohai Bay.
Bohai Bay is another tragic example. The pollution levels are so high that entire fish populations have been wiped out.
So it's not just a local problem. It's impacting whole ecosystems. And this all goes back to the cancer cell analogy, right?
Absolutely. Just like a tumor that grows and consumes its host, China's environmental practices are destroying the delicate balance of its surroundings.
Okay, so pollution is a major red flag. But what about all those big infrastructure projects China's always building? Don't those sometimes cause more problems than they solve?
That's another issue the sources bring up. They use the Three Gorges Dam as a perfect example.
The Three Gorges Dam. That's that huge dam on the Yangtze River, right?
Yeah.
I remember hearing about it being this engineering marvel.
It's an impressive feat of engineering, no doubt, but it's also been blamed for a lot of environmental and social problems. There were experts, people like Huang Wanli, who warned about the risks of building it, but their concerns were ignored.
So what happened to this Huang Wanli? Was he just brushed aside?
Sadly, no. The source mentions that he was basically silenced by the government for speaking out against the dam project.
Wow, that's chilling. It really makes you think about what happens to those who dare to criticize the government in China. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the environment and this tendency to ignore warnings. But what about the economic side of things? How does that fit into this cancer cell analogy?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. The sources take a hard look at China's economic policies, and they point out some disturbing trends. Things like land grabbing from farmers, exploitation of workers, and this relentless pursuit of economic growth, even if it means sacrificing sustainability and social justice.
So it's like they're focused on short-term gains, even if it means long-term pain.
Exactly. And the sources use some pretty shocking examples to illustrate this. One that really stood out to me was about a village official who was caught driving a car worth 10 million yuan.
10 million? That's like winning the lottery. What's that got to do with anything?
Well, it highlights the massive wealth gap in China. While some are living the high life, others are barely scraping by on less than $1 a day. And it feeds into this bigger idea that the CCP is putting its own power and the interests of the elite above the well-being of ordinary citizens.
Okay, so we've got environmental damage, suppression of dissent, and economic inequality. That's a pretty grim picture. But isn't there another side to this story? Don't a lot of Chinese people actually believe in their government and where the country is headed?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that the sources address directly. They dig into this concept of Chinese patriotism, how it's been shaped by their history and the messaging from the CCP.
So it's not just blind obedience, there's a genuine emotional component to this.
Absolutely. To understand Chinese patriotism, we need to look back at China's century of humiliation, a period where they were exploited and weakened by foreign powers. That experience left a deep scar on their national psyche.
So it's like a collective trauma that's fueling their desire for strength and unity.
Exactly. And the CCP has been very effective at tapping into that sentiment. They use it to justify their actions and to rally support for their agenda. The sources point out how history is taught in schools, how the media is controlled, how national heroes are celebrated. It's all carefully crafted to reinforce this narrative of national pride and unity.
So it's not just brainwashing. It's about tapping into a real sense of shared history and identity.
It's more nuanced than that. The sources suggest that the CCP has created a system where patriotism and loyalty to the party are almost inseparable. It's tough to criticize the government without appearing unpatriotic.
So on the one hand, we have this image of China as a potentially destructive force. But on the other hand, we have this strong sense of patriotism and a genuine belief in their own narrative.
It's a fascinating puzzle, and to truly understand it, we have to be willing to look at both sides of the coin. The economic realities, the environmental concerns, the political motivations, and the deeply rooted cultural factors, they all contribute to this complex picture of China. And you know, this cancer cell analogy, it really becomes clear when you see how the CCP handles anyone who disagrees with them.
Right, because cancer cells, they don't exactly play by the rules. They just take over and ignore any kind of checks and balances.
Exactly. In a healthy system, things are balanced, different parts talk to each other, keep each other in check. But the CCP, they seem to disrupt that balance. It's like their own power and control are the only things that matter.
Kind of like how those cancer cells ignore the signals that would normally tell them, hey, slow down.
Precisely. And silencing critics like Huang Wanli, the guy who warned about the Three Gorges Dam, that's a prime example.
Yeah, it's a tough reminder that economic progress and freedom don't always go hand in hand. But here's where I'm struggling a bit. I get the environmental damage and the silencing of dissent, but isn't it possible that there's more to China's actions than just this need for control and growth? We were talking about patriotism earlier, right? Could that be a factor?
You're definitely right to bring that up. The sources acknowledge that Chinese patriotism is a really powerful force, and it shapes how people see their country's actions.
It's like that old saying, my country, right or wrong.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. The sources really delve into how the CCP has skillfully intertwined patriotism and loyalty to the party.
So criticizing the government is almost like being unpatriotic.
Exactly. And they've done a good job of reminding people about China's history of being humiliated by foreign powers. It creates this deep-seated desire for strength and unity.
So it's a mix of genuine patriotism and a carefully constructed narrative. It's like they've created this cycle where national pride reinforces the CCP's power, and the CCP's power reinforces national pride.
You got it. And that cycle makes it really hard to have open and honest discussions about where China is going, both inside and outside the country.
Okay, so we've got this cancer cell analogy, which focuses on uncontrolled growth and breaking the rules, but we've also got this deep well of patriotism that the CCP has carefully shaped. It's a pretty complex situation, to say the least.
It really is. And the sources stress that understanding both of these things is key if we want to have any hope of engaging with China in a way that makes sense.
But how do we reconcile these two seemingly opposing ideas? On one side, we have China as a potential threat. On the other, we have this genuine desire for national rejuvenation and a lot of pride among the Chinese people. It's like we're talking about two different Chinas.
That's the challenge, isn't it? It's easy to fall into the trap of picking a side, to see China as either the bad guy or the victim. But the sources are urging us to resist that oversimplification. We need to recognize that it's a complex situation. China is both a potential threat and a country trying to find its place in the world.
So it's not about choosing sides, it's about acknowledging the nuances and the contradictions.
You got it. And it's about recognizing that we all have our own biases, our own histories, our own fears that shape how we see China.
It's like we're all looking at the same elephant, but from different angles, and so we each have a different description.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights how important it is to have open conversations, to think critically, and to be willing to listen to different viewpoints. The truth about China is probably somewhere in the messy middle, not in these neat little boxes we often try to put it in.
Okay, so we've explored this cancer cell analogy, we've looked at the role of Chinese patriotism, and we've even considered how our own perceptions might be affecting our judgment. But where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
The biggest takeaway, I think, is that this conversation about China's role in the world is far from over. It's a process, and it's something we all need to be actively thinking about.
Actively thinking, but what are we supposed to be doing? Like trying to cure China or something?
No, not at all. Remember, this analogy is just a way to understand things, not a call to action. The point is to get past simplistic labels and to engage with China in a way that recognizes both its potential and its challenges.
So it's about finding a balance. We can't ignore the worries about China's behavior, but we can't dismiss the genuine patriotism and aspirations of its people either.
Exactly. Finding that balance requires open dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to see things from different points of view. It won't be easy, but it's crucial if we want to navigate this complicated relationship and create a future that's more stable and sustainable.
Well, after all that, I think I need a moment to process everything. But before we do that, let's quickly recap what we've covered. We started with this thought-provoking cancer cell analogy, which helped us understand some concerns about China's behavior. Then we looked at how powerful Chinese patriotism is and how history and the CCP have shaped it. And finally, we touched on how our own biases can affect our judgment and how important open and honest dialogue is. We'll be right back to wrap things up and explore what this all means for the future. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
Okay, we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into this whole question of whether China is a threat to the world.
And it's important to remember, this isn't just some theoretical debate. It has real-world consequences, especially when you consider the impact China's actions have on a global scale.
Right, because, like you said before, a cancer cell, it doesn't just affect one part of the body. It can spread everywhere.
Exactly. The sources we looked at, they highlight how China's economic policies, for example, have had this ripple effect across the entire globe.
Give me some specifics. What kind of ripple effects are we talking about?
Think about all the talk about trade imbalances, intellectual property theft, competition for resources. Those are all playing out on a global level, and China's a major player.
So what you're saying is China's economic growth has created both opportunities and challenges for the rest of the world.
Exactly. And understanding how all these forces are interacting, well, that's key to navigating the global economy.
Okay, so that's the economic side of things. But what about the environmental impact? I mean, we talked about pollution in China, but how does that affect us over here?
More than you might think. One of the sources pointed out that China's carbon emissions are the highest in the world. And that directly affects climate change, which is a global issue.
Right, climate change. It doesn't care about borders. What happens in China affects all of us.
Exactly. And it's not just carbon emissions. Pollution in the rivers and oceans, that doesn't stay put either. It can travel huge distances, impacting ecosystems and economies far from China.
It's like this massive web. Everything's interconnected. What happens in one place has consequences everywhere else.
That's the reality of globalization, and it really underlines the need for cooperation and understanding, even when there are disagreements and tensions.
Okay, so we've explored this cancer cell analogy. We've talked about history and culture and how they shape China's actions. We've even admitted that maybe we have some biases of our own. But where do we go from here? What are we supposed to do with all this information?
The sources don't offer any simple solutions. They don't tell us how to fix China or contain its influence. But they do stress the importance of awareness.
So it's not about finding a solution. It's about understanding the problem.
Exactly. The more we understand the complexities of China, the better we can engage with them.
Engage? How are we supposed to be trying to, like, cure China?
No, not at all. This analogy, remember, it's just a way to help us understand, not a plan of action. The goal is to move past these simple labels and engage with China in a way that recognizes both its potential and its challenges.
So it's about figuring out a way to coexist, even if we don't always see eye to eye.
Right. And that's going to take open dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to see things from different perspectives.
Well, I think we've definitely given our listeners a lot to think about. This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has. And hopefully it'll encourage our listeners to keep exploring these issues, to have these thoughtful discussions about China's place in the world.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration. Until then, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.